Tonight, we're going to talk about the virtue ethics of David Hume. And David Hume is an incredibly influential philosopher. He died in 1776. But since then, so a couple hundred years, he's had a really huge influence on a lot of people. And one of the reasons in particular that we're going to study him is because more recently, thanks to the work of people like Christine Swanton and a few others, he's been, I guess, talked about as a virtue ethicist. And actually, I prefer this reading of Hume compared to the traditional reading of Hume. And so that's kind of where it gets into our particular class. Toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to, contrast Aristotle and Hume so that we can see basically the differences. But Hume will also very clearly contrast with a bunch of the other theories. So, just going to lay out some of the basics of Humean virtue ethics as we read in Christine Swanton, and I'm going to end the lecture with Jonathan Bennett. Now, I'm not going to go over any of the interviews from Very Bad Wizards that I assigned. I love those interviews, for example, with Simon Blackburn and other people. This is a really fantastic book. Would totally recommend to anyone to pick up this book. It's one of the few books that I would recommend to pretty much anyone. That said, they kind of stand on their own, and Hume isn't like the most important for them, or getting Hume right isn't the most important, and I like to make him more complex than the traditional interpretation often makes him. So that's why we're going to stick with the Swanton piece, and that's ultimately why we're also going to talk about Jonathan Bennett, because I think his piece is like one of the most important as far as showing how different mental faculties play into morality. And honestly, the Jonathan Bennett piece, along with only really a handful of other pieces, is one that I wish I had written because I think it's beautifully well written. I think that the examples are incredible, and I think that the argument and the upshot are really important. And that's why I've decided to focus on these two. Okay, so let's get started. So Christine Swanton, she's written a lot of books on virtue ethics. And in particular, she's done a lot to codify this idea that Hume is a virtue ethicist. Now, she has, like I said, a lot of stuff on virtue ethics. And the central idea is that just virtues are really important for virtue ethics. You can't understand right action. You can't understand happiness. You can't understand the main or most important ethical theories without understanding virtue. That's what it means to be a virtue ethicist. This is going to contrast with the utilitarians. Utilitarians are going to say you only look at the consequences of actions. You don't have to deal with virtue really there. And the Kantians are going to say that you only have to deal with the principles of rationality or the moral law. You don't have to deal with virtues there. Now, Kant does have a virtue theory, right? And Mill is kind of a hybrid between Aristotle and his utilitarian teacher, Jeremy Bentham. That said, virtues aren't central to them. Virtues aren't central to them, but they are to virtue ethicists. Aristotle without virtues, that wouldn't make any sense. And she's going to say Hume without virtues, that's also not going to make sense. And why is that the case? Well, we're going to kind of find out here. So for Hume, one of the most important things is that virtues ultimately come down to something like a capacity to feel with respect to objects or events out there in the world. Okay? So the traditional interpretation of Hume is as a pure sentimentalist and a pure anti-rationalist. What I mean by that is sentimentalism means there's something like a moral sense or a feeling that's really central to us, and that's what's making moral judgments, and that's the only thing, okay? And the anti-rationalism is basically reason doesn't have any role whatsoever in this psychological view. All right. She's going to say it's a little more complicated than that. All right. The problem with sentimentalism is that it makes it look as though morality only comes down to subjective feelings. I feel that a certain situation should elicit sympathy. Therefore, it's right or wrong for me to do something. But it's all based on me. It's subjectivism. Each person is the standard of their own moral code. And she's going to say, not so fast. Not so fast. even though it is the case that we have individual psychological faculties that really matter, there are facts about what they're reacting to. And a lot of this literature, so she cites David Wiggins, who's another philosopher who talks about this kind of stuff. A lot of literature compares this to color perception, right? So whenever I try to look at the color, say, of that font on Christine Swanton's name, it's red, all right? That does have to do with my individual faculty to perceive that particular color. But there is somewhat of a fact of the matter. Now, this is controversial, right? But there is somewhat of a fact of the matter that that font is actually red. And it's the dynamic interaction between the perceiver and between what's being perceived that is really important here. So it's subjective in the sense that it relies on capacities, individual capacities, but it's objective in the sense that there's something out there in the world that we're actually properly responding to. It seems as though there is a fact of the matter about what color that particular font is. And so she's going to say that similar to color perception, that's kind of how morality is working, right? It's not all subjective. There are sort of objective grounds. And then this gets complicated with Hume's idea of extensive sympathy. And I'll kind of get into that. But virtues, since they're taking this sentimentalist route, you can think of them as capacities to feel. So it is something within us. But we feel properly with respect to objects or events that happen out there in the world, right? There is a fact of the matter that whenever you see someone suffering needlessly, that you should have a negative reaction to that. It's not just your individual opinion and that you happen to feel bad about that. That very event elicits properly a reaction that makes you feel bad about seeing unneeded suffering, right? So that's the interpretation that I'm going to espouse in this particular video. Usually this feeling, or one of the most central binaries of feeling, is approbation or disapprobation. So basically approval or disapproval. You feel good or you feel bad. Naturally, we should feel good toward good things. I see someone helping someone out in need, I feel good. I approve of that. I see someone kicking someone when they're down, I feel bad about that. And, that's kind of what's going on here. You have to pay attention to the feeling, and you have to pay attention to how people approve or disapprove of things. One of the central themes in Hume's writings, and he wrote a lot. Like I have a lot of his works. I've taken classes on David Hume. There are tons and tons of commentaries on kind of what he's doing. If you were to take my ethics class, we would read parts of the Enquiry Concerning Principles of Morals, which I'm just looking for my book, right? It's kind of a thick tome. It's less than 100 pages, the Inquiry. The rest of this is commentary and appendices just to try to figure out what he's saying. And this is just one volume of what Hume wrote, okay? But a central idea in a lot of his writings is that theoretical reason cannot get us very far, right? Whenever we look at deep theory, we look at, say, the way scientists think about the world or arrange things, or we look at principles of cause and effect, or whatever else it is, what we find is that the theoretical reason can always be doubted. We can always undermine the justification by which we think certain things. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because it puts theoretical reason into its place. Hume is writing in the 1700s, okay? This is, in the Enlightenment. You're starting to see the upswing of science. You're starting to see a lot of people taking on new ideas of physics and the universe and all types of stuff. We've supplanted the idea that, the gods or God made people or nature in one particular way, and that is the most central thing, right? We saw that we are not the center of the universe. We're just one body rotating around other bodies. We're seeing a lot of ideas, and we're seeing a lot of faith placed in the sciences. Hume, I think, is reacting to this. and he's really, really intelligent, okay? He likes science. He understands that there are a lot of really important and useful things that sciences do. However, he's going to say they also have their limits. They also have their limits. And so people got really frustrated with Hume. He was a controversial figure because he poked holes not only in religion, because again, he kind of like is someone who is very, very critical, even though he himself went to church regularly, right? But he thought that religion was dangerous. Same thing he did to science. Science is really great, but we should really contextualize and put into its place theoretical reason. Now, despite the fact that we can doubt away a lot of theoretical justifications, he's going to say, yeah, that's kind of a bummer, right? It sucks that we don't have this impartial point of view like scientists think we do to disinterestedly observe the universe. But despite that, we have feelings, right? And he says, whenever I have these deep melancholies where I've spent all day or several days reading about philosophy and showing the limitations of theoretical reason, what do? He takes a walk. He hangs out with his friends. He enjoys some sort of pleasure like good food. Hume was like, I think, pretty well over 300 pounds toward the latter parts of his life. So the idea is theoretical reason can't do everything we think it can, but we have inborn senses and we have social relations that help us to get beyond that. Okay? Some commentators of Hume kind of take this to say that whenever he says skeptic, the contemporary meaning of skeptic, I guess there's a couple. The colloquial meaning, so the way everyday people use it, is someone who is doubting something. The philosophical meaning is basically you think that there is no ultimate justification or warrant for certain types of beliefs or knowledge. You can't have absolutely certain knowledge about anything. That's what a skeptic would be in the contemporary philosophical sense. There's a different meaning, and in particular with the Pyrrhonian skeptics, the ancient skeptics like Sextus Empiricus, where some commentators have said they think that Hume means it in this sense because the Pyrrhonian skeptics, or Sextus Empiricus, they basically showed that there is no way to understand a lot of things, but you don't let that affect really how you live. You still sort of go with the flow. You rely on convention and stuff like that to get through things. And so some people like to read Hume in a similar sort of way. This is going to make sense as we keep going through the semester, or not through the semester, also through the semester, but through this particular presentation. All right. In particular, this makes sense why he has this really strong sense of sentimentalism, namely that human emotions respond to things. So the primary faculty is not reason. Reason is involved, okay? We need reason to figure out how to do things. We need reason in understanding the context of certain situations. We can't get along without reason. But if we're looking at what is the sort of ruling faculty in morality, it's emotion, okay? And that's what makes him a sentimentalist. Contrast to Aristotle, he is an intellectualist or a rationalist. Reason is the capacity that's running the show there. Emotions are important, but reason is running the show. It's sort of the inverse of this in Hume, which again is why I'm teaching him after Aristotle. And the central idea here is that each of us, inside of each of us, is what he calls a moral sense. And the moral sense, according to Christine Swanton, has 3 different parts that are really worth emphasizing. And he includes a lot of different virtues, a lot of different emotions and feelings in his work. Like I said, he wrote a lot. But she stresses these, and I think that these are a good 3 things to sort of stress. The first is self-love. Okay? Within our moral sense, we need to have something like regard for ourselves. This is also sometimes called prudence. We do things that are useful, especially for ourselves. We have some sort of self-interest. However, again, contrast Mandeville, contrast people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. We are not completely self-interested, and we are not, everything can't be reduced to self-interest, okay? So we do have self-interest. It is really important, right? It's one of the three things that I'm going to talk about. But if we were all self-interested, that wouldn't account for a lot of the things that happen in morality. Why do parents make sacrifices for their children? Or, secondarily, why do people hurt themselves if it also will hurt someone else? Spite is super, super important to consider, all right? And so that's why benevolence is the second thing that Christine Swanton talks about. With benevolence, we can think of this as roughly other regard. We care about other people. And some people call this altruism, meaning it's something that either goes beyond self-interest or it is direct interest for other people, right? Parents, I think, are another really great example. Or friends, whenever you give up sleep to talk with your friend because they're really going through stuff, it's in your best interest to just get more sleep or whatever else, right? But you don't do that because you care about your friends. This is kind of what benevolence is talking about. But again, benevolence can't be the entirety of morality. It's not just all about self-sacrifice. We don't think that someone who is giving so much of themselves that there's nothing left, they're like completely sacrificial, self-sacrificial. We don't think that that's a good life, right? And that's why he's going to say benevolence works with self-love. These two things need to balance each other out. And then the last thing, and I would argue that this is the most important, is his notion of extensive sympathy. Sympathy. Now, sympathy is coming from the Greek word sum, meaning with, pathos, meaning feeling or suffering. You're feeling with another person, okay? Contemporarily, we might make a distinction between sympathy, feeling for, and empathy, trying to feel the exact same thing as someone else, right? But no matter what it is, emotions can kind of lead to really big problems. So in the South, for example, especially in the Jim Crow South, so, after the Civil War, but before the Civil Rights era, there were a lot of Black folk that got put on trial and were convicted of crimes that they were innocent of, right? Now, that can happen for overtly anti-Black reasons, okay? It can happen because Americans don't like Black people in the South in certain parts after the Civil War, right? But a lot of people have actually said that's not the entire story, or maybe it's not even the most useful way of looking at things. What we should realize about sympathy is that very often it's psychologically taxing, it takes a lot out of you, and it's very limited in scope. So you only tend to apply sympathy to people who are alike you or who you grew up around, right? And so they would, whenever they looked at white jurors convicting Black people of crimes they were innocent of, they would say it's less about the antipathy toward Black people and more about sympathizing with white victims or sympathizing with a white community, right? So sympathy, it seems as though it's this, touchy-feely idea that can get us to just feel what other people are feeling and keep us from doing bad things. Not so. It's way more complicated than that. And contemporarily, some people, Paul Bloom, he's a psychologist at Yale, have argued against sympathy. Now, Hume wasn't an idiot. Hume was really, really intelligent, and he saw the capacity for something like sympathy to be abused. He saw that it could be very limited, right? Great Britain back then was waging wars. There were tons of factioning within the British government. He saw the ways in which sympathy could be abused. So when he talks about sympathy, I want you to remember that whenever he's talking about it, he's talking about a universal sympathy, all right? It's not just a feeling for people that you, I guess, feel for in as a matter of fact or of course throughout life. He wants it to be something more generalizable. You should have a sympathy with humankind overall, okay? So sympathy is a fellow feeling, right? You do feel bad when other people feel bad. You do feel good when other people feel good. But he's very clearly saying that it's not good enough to just feel those like we normally feel those. We want to get less bias. All right, I'll return to this particular point. So he doesn't think that there's a completely impartial point of view, and he doesn't think that ethics can be done impartially. All right, part of being human means that we value certain people over others. It's natural for a parent, for example, to value their child over, say, a neighbor, right? Hume is okay with that. He's okay with certain natural types of partiality. However, he is not okay with just letting that be the end. And central to our moral sense is learning to take a social perspective and to exercise our sympathies and our abilities to feel with other communities and humankind more generally. All right? So the sentimentalism is really, really important. It's not theoretical ethics in the sense that he's laying out lots of universal principles or anything like that. That's not what Hume is doing. Rather, and moreover, he doesn't think that that's a problem. It's not bad that you can't offer moral principles. Why? Because we have a moral sense. And within each of us, we have this ability to have self-love and benevolence and extensive sympathy to react to things out there in the world. That moral sense, that core of our sentiments and our virtues, reacting to things as they are out there in the world, that is the basis for morality. Not reason, not principle. Okay? And so the last point is just to make it very clear. Each of these three things is necessary, but none of them are sufficient in and of themselves, right? I'm not exactly sure whether Swanton would call them jointly sufficient, meaning all three basically is all that you need. I don't think that's what she's arguing, but you definitely need all three, so they're necessary. And if you don't have one of the three, you're missing some very important aspect of morality. Okay. This is a very complicated picture. Apologize ahead of time. I will put this on Blackboard in case this matters. But I wanted to make some sort of diagram to really show what Christine Swanton is talking about, because it's a really complex paper that I had you read, but it's so that we could sort of lay a basis for the way certain things might work for virtue ethicists in interacting with the world. Let me grab my mouse so that I can point. All right. So as I said, in each subject, and we have to pretend that my dog is a subject, we have a moral sense, and this is the self-love, benevolence, and extensive sympathy. Okay? Inside each of us, we have some sort of mental faculty, right? But we don't just use these, arbitrarily or willy-nilly to discriminate as we care. There are bases for right or wrong judgment. And so if she's looking at this book, let's take this color analogy. There is a fact of the matter about what color that should be for dogs, right? Dogs have different vision than us, right? So it's not doesn't, red, green, blue. It's not like that. It doesn't work in our eyes. But there is a fact of the matter about how dogs under, ideal or standard lighting conditions would actually see that color or would see that shape, right? Similarly, morality is like that. We have individual capacities, but those capacities do in fact relate to facts or events out there in the world, right? So what happens, and this is why she mentioned Wiggins' sensible subjectivism. What's really important to stress here is that there's a dynamic interaction between the two things. It is not completely subjective in the sense that I am the standard of my morality, right? If we have disagreements about something, the disagreements are corrected by making sure that each person is just saying what they sincerely mean, right? There's no other perspective outside of that. That's not what Hume is saying is going on. At least that's what Christine Swanton is saying, and that's what I would agree with as well. Rather, there is also a basis in the objects themselves, right? So the virtues and the vices, she's going to say, are part of the things out there in the world. Whenever you see certain objects or see certain events in an ideal person, they would have a certain type of emotional reaction. Okay? Now, what becomes the basis for virtues or vices? This is where it gets very, very complicated. There's a lot of debates in here about how to interpret this. One strand is going to say what makes virtues or vices are just the sentiments or the sort of characteristics that we have that are the most useful to humankind generally. So Hume talks about happiness. He says that happiness, roughly, is a life of action, pleasure, and indolence. So what he means is that humans are their happiest whenever they're out there and they're doing things, right? If we're not doing things, if we're not interacting with people, that sucks, right? That's what makes quarantine really terrible. And that we've been in it for 6 months or whatever, that it makes it really, really grating. It's really hard to live whenever we can't have actions and interactions with other people. Human happiness relies on that. Pleasure. Humans have a capacity for pleasure. Aristotle also agrees, right? And if we had a life completely devoid of any pleasures, that would not be a life that we would call happy. So he thinks that pleasure is really important. And indolence, it's kind of a weird word because it has connotations of laziness today. I think a more neutral word would probably be something like leisure, right? So we need leisure, we need free time, we need time to be able to rest, we need time to play, and that is also really, really important. We can't always be up to things that we absolutely need for survival. That kind of life where you're only doing what you need to survive is not one where we would call happiness, right? So he has these views on human happiness, and on one interpretation of him, you could say any sentiment or any emotional disposition within us that promotes that end for all of humanity, that's why we keep it. So why do we cultivate self-love? Because on the whole, whenever people cultivate self-love, that helps them to be happy, right? And Swanton agrees with that. She says that that's right. Hume definitely says those types of things. However, she's going to say he also says that there are certain virtues, there are certain sentiments or ways of being that don't necessarily contribute to human happiness. Okay? There are certain sentiments or ways of being or things that we can do in certain ways that don't contribute to human happiness. Right? So actions of being a parent or a really deep friend, like I've already talked about, those don't always lead to action. Those don't always lead to pleasure. Sometimes you have to have really awkward conversations with your friends. Those don't always lead to leisure. Maybe they lead to more work. Sometimes there are meaningful things in life that don't lead to pleasure, right? That don't lead to leisure or anything like that. And she's going to say that's okay. And what then would basically make them have the distinction of being a virtue? She says this is where competent judges or authoritative judges or the moral point of view comes in. Right? And so this is like she's combining his moral philosophy with his aesthetic theory here, because Hume wrote a lot about art. But she says basically it can be a virtue if it contributes to human happiness. Okay? But even stuff that doesn't directly contribute to the happiness of humanity overall can still be a virtue if these competent or authoritative judges sort of see it fit for people to have those sentiments or those emotional dispositions, that type of emotional intelligence with respect to objects or events or anything like that. All right? What does that mean? Well, authoritative judges, they're able to sort of understand what's going on. And this is the yellow text and what's going on underneath the yellow text, because they have faculties that are basically working well. All right? They have natural, usual sympathies. So we would call someone an authoritative judge if they are sympathetic, but again, not too sympathetic. So it's pretty natural for someone to, like I said, favor their children over a complete stranger. That's okay. And in fact, if someone did not favor their children over a complete stranger, we would say that's really messed up. So this is what he means. We need to have natural and usual sympathies. We don't need to be martyrs, right? We don't need to be these like hermits that are secluding ourselves or trying to scrutinize every single thing. She's saying that's not what we want. We want a natural sympathy. That said, it can't be too partial, and the judgments that competent judges or authoritative judges make are not too partial. We want them generalizable. We want them to apply to pretty much any human being, at least in a sort of semi-abstract sense. Not abstract in the sense that he's talking about universal laws, right? That is not what he's talking about. But abstract in the sense that the judgments that an authoritative judge or a group of authoritative judges could come to, they will not really change, right? If they see this case again and again, they'll have the exact same verdict every single time, all right? Also, and this is point number 3, the moral point of view, or the judges here, they're really considerate of the facts of the case and of just knowledge of what it's like to be a human being who possesses the trait of reacting to certain things in a certain way. Okay? So this is why he is not anti-rationalist. We need types of knowledge that help us to understand who I am, for example, what situation I am interacting with, and what it would be like if I developed, say, more sympathy, right? So these competent judges, they use their cognition to evaluate lots of different things. But the moral sense is kind of what's doing the approving and the disapproving. So you have to have all of that background information there. And this kind of like relates to the 4th point, which is the experience to discriminate finely, real versus fake, all right? The parenthetical remark is mine, obviously. So the reason why this matters is experience is crucially important to morality. This is important for both Aristotle and Hume. And a good example of this, and Christine Swanton kind of talks about this, is someone who is just like, complimenting you or doing something to like basically, pat you on the back and say, wow, really well done, right? Like I'm impressed with that. I'm proud of you. I like what you've done here. That is going to look very, very similar to a sort of mock praise or someone potentially sucking up to someone. It's really hard often to tell those two things apart. Or someone who is genuinely like complimenting or supporting their friends versus someone who is manipulating people so that they can get them to do what they want. Sometimes those are really, really difficult to distinguish. Competent judges, authoritative judges, have the experiences in life and the knowledge of how humanity works to be able to distinguish the really fine-grained distinctions that we need to make certain types of moral judgments. Okay? And on the whole, we want balanced virtue. That's the last point. So we don't want someone who's just like completely and totally generous, right? In the sense that they give everything away from themselves and they let their children starve. Okay? It's possible on the Humean picture to say that they are virtuous in some respect, right? They are generous. However, they also are not a very good parent. They aren't taking seriously the suffering of their children. So that's why the virtues need to be balanced overall. So these authoritative or these competent judges are people who they understand that human life has sort of natural feelings and natural partialities. We value certain things over the others. And they have lots of experience to realize that there's a lot of complex goods and competing things that go on in life. Kind of like Aristotle talks with moral luck, right? You have all of this experience. And on the whole, they're the kind of people that we would want to emulate, right? You don't want the opinion of just anyone. Side note, have you ever noticed that whenever you want to do something bad, you might go and seek the advice of someone who you know is going to give you the answer that you want? Right? Hume wants us to basically get away from that. What does all of this mean? The reflection exercise that we did for this particular unit was centered around the sensible knave. So at the very end of the Enquiry Considering the Principles of Morals, Hume talks about the sensible knave. This is this person who doesn't think like us. They don't have a moral sense in the way that we do, and they don't feel remorse at, say, cheating on their spouse, or committing tax fraud, or stealing luxury goods whenever they can get away with it, right? There's this person, they're completely sensible, right? They're able to maintain a good reputation. They're able to maintain really great family lives. They're able to have good friendships and all that kind of stuff. But they will do bad things whenever they can get away with it, right? They like to do bad stuff with their friends, right? I don't know if you ever saw that video of that kid who steals his grandma's car. How does Hume deal with that? And like I said, this is one of the problems with potentially not being completely objective, in the sense that if there is no external standard outside of myself, outside of convention, right? How do I deal with someone like that? I can't appeal to the 10 Commandments. Sensible knave doesn't believe in them. I can't appeal to an external standard. The sensible knave doesn't believe in them. And moreover, I don't think that rationality and principles are where morality consists in, right? Morality consists in sentiment. And what happens if someone's sentiment is messed up? And that's the problem, right? That's the problem. What Swanton is trying to show here is that even if you have a sentimentalist picture, you can make errors about particular judgments. I can make an error about what color the feather is on that book, or the bird is on that book. That bird is red, that feather is white. Okay? Sure, it depends on some sort of individual faculty, but there is a fact of the matter. How could I potentially adjudicate that? Well, I could make sure that, first of all, my moral sense is functioning properly, right? Second of all, I can also go out and ask competent judges. This is something that Aristotle recommends. You don't know what to do? Go ask your friends, right? So there's a lot of commonalities between these two, and I'll draw the distinctions here in a couple of slides, right? So I think that what Swanton is trying to do here is she's offering a way to get Hume out of a lot of the problems of sentimentalism, and in particular, subjectivist sentimentalism. Because if it all comes down to just individual feelings, if someone doesn't feel that it's bad to cheat on their spouse in a monogamous relationship, then I have no basis for opposing that. And she's going to say, not so, not so. There is suffering involved in that. There is suffering involved in that, and there is a correct way of feeling toward those things that is evidenced by these authoritative or these competent judges, right? And that's really, really important to consider, all right? So I hope that kind of makes sense. A lot of moving parts. The traditional interpretation of Hume, or I guess the most prevalent, is that he's purely subjectivist, purely sentimentalist. Morality just comes down to your individual feelings, even sympathy, right? That's oversimplified, but that's the general trend that they're going to go toward. There is no science or set of principles that can be used there. You have to defer to experience, and there are natural inclinations of feeling in certain ways. Swanton agrees with all of that, but she says that's not enough. There are facts of the matter, and there are proper ways for your moral sense to be relating. And morality isn't just the subjective aspect. It is this dynamic interaction between your capacities to perceive things and the facts of the matter as the objects are, right? Morality doesn't exist completely apart from humans. Humans have to be able to perceive it. On the other hand, humans don't just get to perceive whatever they want. That's not how it works. It's not like imagination. You don't just make up whatever you want. There are bases for this. There are better and worse ways of perceiving the world, and there are more and less appropriate ways of feeling toward things that happen out there. So virtues for Swanton are things that help happiness of humanity overall, right? So she's basically saying it's not about mere benefit or usefulness. Anti-utilitarian. We'll get to the utilitarians. She's going to say it's about sentiment. It's about how we feel, approbation, disapprobation. We feel love or hate towards certain things. There are right and wrong ways of feeling. However, despite the fact that it is emotion first, a priority on emotion, those sentiments are reasoned. We have background information and they're educated. Social conventions and how we grow up and who we learn from really deeply influence how we feel things. Sentiments aren't just brute, they aren't stupid, they aren't things that are just naturally ingrained in the sense that we can just always trust our conscience. Conscience is formed, okay? It's educated throughout our lives, and we have to be very, very careful about it. We can be partial, so the parents can be partial to their children, or we can be partial to our friends over, perfect strangers. But Hume realizes that sympathy is also very dangerous in the sense that if we did that, things like sexism, racism, xenophobia, all of those types of things would be rampant problems. So, as much as possible, you also have to try to generalize your sympathy such that you feel toward all of humanity, not just the people you grew up with, not just, people who you already like. And this last point is something that's really interesting here, is that there are answers about morality, okay? But there also can be disagreements. I think that Hume, like Aristotle, is going to say, look, it just depends in a lot of ways, right? And this is why people don't like virtue ethicists, by the way. They think virtue ethicists are kind of slimy. They sort of dance in the gray area. They call a lot of things complex when they don't need to be complex and stuff like that. And it's because virtue ethicists, on the whole, are not going to espouse universal principles that always apply. I'm not going to say that it's always reason. They're going to be more holistic. Who is the person? What is the situation that they're dealing with? How are they, thinking through particular things? Hume, even more so, is like this. Because again, he's even skeptical of the deepest, most profoundest, and the most successful sciences, right? He doesn't think they can be completely impartial, so why would he think that morality can be completely impartial? It doesn't make any sense. That said, disagreements are going to vary in extent and, intensity. Pretty much no one is going to disagree with the fact that you should not kill innocent people. Are there potential exceptions? Yeah, maybe, right? Maybe war is an exception, collateral damage or something like that. Maybe. I'm not saying that it is. But people are going to be much, much closer in agreement that you should not kill innocent people. Compare that to a case that Hume talks about, and Swanton talks about this, luxury. What counts as luxury? And that's going to give rise to a lot more disagreement. So if you look at American life, like my grandma grew up in a dirt floor house, right? Before she bought her house. I mean, she bought her house when she was a teenager because she had to take care of her siblings. A really interesting woman. But like maybe my grandma, I mean, she definitely was like super excited whenever her house that she eventually bought got indoor plumbing and then electricity and then air conditioning, right? And then TV and then color TV, right? What would be luxurious to my grandma is not luxurious to me. I like air conditioning, right? I like indoor plumbing. I like electricity. I like all of these things. So there might be more disagreement about something like what luxury is. Whereas when it comes to harming innocent people, a lot less disagreement there, right? And what's important to emphasize here is that there can be answers, okay? And it matters who's giving those answers. Those judges need to adapt the moral point of view, and they need to be competent or authoritative in all the ways that I talked about on the previous graphic. However, there's no outside standard. There's no completely outside standard. And given that, that means that disagreement is always possible. Disagreement is always possible. Okay, so let me take a step back and kind of talk about Aristotle versus Hume. And let's first of all talk about what they have in agreement, because I've lumped them together right at the beginning of the semester. despite the fact that in a lot of ways they're kind of the most complex. At least they have a lot of different moving parts, but I think that it's really, really important, right? The first thing that they have in common is that happiness requires certain psychological patterns. You have to deeply pay attention to moral psychology, which I'm going to reiterate later. It matters for Aristotle, your dispositions of how you act, think, feel, and are motivated. It matters for Hume, your dispositions for feeling towards certain facts and events. Happiness really deeply relies on having good psychological patterns. Moral education and convention also matter. One sec, my dog is tearing up the couch. I don't know if that worked. But moral education and convention really, really deeply matter to who we are. All right? If we are raised in a bad convention or in a bad community, it's quite possible that our capacities, in Aristotle's case, or reflection or practical wisdom, though that might be tainted, the ways that we understand things might be tainted. And for Hume, our sentiments might be tainted. We might not learn to feel the right way toward things, or, feeling good toward bad things or bad toward good things, right? It matters, the process of moral education and convention. Next is the idea that I didn't phrase this in the most neutral way, but I think both Aristotle and Hume are anthropocentric in the sense that morality is only ever indexed to humans and human practices. They're not trying to dictate morality for all rational beings. That's what Kant thinks he's doing. They're only trying to say what is proper for us. What's proper for us? And they both have a deep deference to the particular cases. Like I said, Aristotle doesn't say what you should or shouldn't do without knowing at least a little bit about who you are, what community you're in, what your options are, and how you can do stuff. Virtue ethicists have to get creative. You have to know all of the details before you can deliver a competent verdict in a case, right? That said, there is kind of a difference, and it's the difference between phronesis and discrimination. Phronesis, the Greek word being practical wisdom. Discrimination, Hume, you could just mean it as being able to discriminate different feelings. So again, think of art or think of color vision. Some people are better than others at seeing different shades, right? Same sort of thing is going on here, but you need to know all of the details. Lastly, in addition to the previous points, is that many goods contribute to happiness. It's not completely reducible to utility or use. So Christine Swanton thinks that that's Hume's view. Can't just make him a utilitarian. And for Aristotle, it's not just reducible to, say, pleasure or to honor or health. You have to have all of those things kind of contributing toward one thing. And the question here is whether any of this is all irreducible to one particular value. So the utilitarians, just to preview what's going to happen here in a bit, utilitarians are going to say that every right or wrong action is reducible to the extent that it promotes good things or avoids bad things. So maybe on certain views that it promotes more pleasure for more people than avoiding more pain for more people, right? And so things are reducible for the utilitarians to, for example, pleasure and pain. It's not clear that that's what's going on with Aristotle and Hume. It's going to be much, much harder for them to reduce all of these goods into one neat package. More likely, a lot of these thinkers are going to take what they call a value pluralist route. And what I mean by this is that a lot of different things are valued, and you just kind of have to check off each of them one by one and try to balance them as best you can. There's no neat answer, right? And that's what I'm trying to emphasize with this particular point. We can set aside the nitty-gritty meta-ethics questions for later, or if you have questions, feel free to ask me. Okay. So given that they have a lot in common, They care about psychology deeply, right? They care about who we are and the patterns of our lives and whether we're achieving happiness. They care about how our social conventions are sort of educating us, moral education, all that kind of stuff. They both talk about virtues and vices, right? It's really easy potentially to confuse these two types of virtue ethics. So I just want to make explicitly clear kind of what's going on, right? So Aristotle is basically going to place a priority on reason, whereas Hume is going to place priority on emotion. So if you want to think about how you come to understand what the right thing to do is, or if you're feeling in a certain way or thinking a certain way, what is the faculty that is going to be the deciding thing? Reason in Aristotle, sentiment or emotion in Hume. Okay? Aristotle, you have to know eudaimonia. You have to know stuff about yourself and your circumstances. You have to know the situations in life that you're facing and how to balance the virtues, right? That's all reason-based. Hume, you need some background facts. You can't get along without reason. But the ultimate discrimination is happening in your moral sense. Are you having the appropriate sentiment of approbation or disapprobation with respect to what's in front of you? Does it make you feel good? Does it make you feel bad? Does it make you feel love or hate? Does it make you approve it or disapprove it? Do you want to praise someone for doing that or blame someone for doing that, right? If you saw that characteristic in someone, would you praise them for having it? Would you blame them for having it? That's a more emotional judgment. That's the first big difference. The second one that's kind of important to emphasize here is that Aristotle bases a lot of these things in facts about human nature and life, whereas Hume bases things in human emotion and response to different things, all right? So again, Aristotle, whenever he thinks about happiness, he analyzes us in a way that like a biologist or an anthropologist would. What is the human animal? What are the traits that are really important for them to develop? What things should they have? What things shouldn't they have? What things should they avoid, right? And how can these facts about what it means to lead a human life and what a human nature is generally universalizable as kind of like a species, how do we understand those things? And then we use those facts to kind of understand how we should behave, right? What virtues are, what vices are, how we can achieve happiness. Hume, by contrast, again, it's about human emotion and responses. Human emotion and responses. So there are general, capacities. So he talks about, the life of pleasure, the life of action, the life where you have a little bit of leisure time. That kind of holds generally, but it's not good enough. And ultimately what it comes down to are these people who have really fantastic moral senses, right? They're full human beings. We would want to emulate our lives like them. They approve that a particular trait, joy, is something that is good for a human being to have, or being a good friend, a friend who will suffer for his friends in certain ways. That also is potentially a good thing, right? The decision there, it's not based in human nature. It's based in feelings. And not just anyone's feelings, but these authoritative or these competent judges. Next is that virtues for the Aristotelian, they increase the probability of flourishing. Okay? I would kind of compare this to something like behavioral science. So virtues aren't sufficient for a good life. We saw that. Okay? You could be an incredibly great person, but if you have terrible luck, Aristotle is going to say that's not good enough. If you have terrible luck in the sense that you're constantly in pain, or that you're in debilitating poverty, or that some really tragic end befalls you, like Priam, he sees his kingdom fall, his favorite son is killed, and the corpse is, dragged around by Achilles. The Greeks break in to his city, and he gets beat to death by, the infant corpse of his grandson. Aristotle is going to say, yeah, that's bad luck. And no matter how good you were, Priam, happiness consists also in luck breaking your way, and that's not enough, right? But you have to have the virtues, because if you don't have them, your chances at flourishing are absolutely ruined. absolutely ruined. So the idea here is that you're making basic observations kind of like a behavioral scientist or a psychologist might. What traits do people have? How can we measure them? What frequency do they show up? People who have these traits, do they report higher or lower satisfaction with their lives? That's kind of the basis you're doing thing. It's a scientific model, but it's not science in the sense of mathematics. It's not precise like that. Aristotle says you can't be precise with human behavior like that. But there is a type of science. There is a type of logic that is at play here. Whereas for Hume, virtues are useful for human happiness, which I've already talked about, or approved by judges, which I've already talked about. And what I want to draw of a contrast here is the difference between the model of maybe behavioral sciences and the critic. If you ever read the review of a movie critic or a food critic or someone like that, especially one that you like, some of them are ridiculous and they see a lot of stupid stuff and there's a lot of pretense and snobbiness in a lot of this stuff. Set those examples aside, right? Sturgeon's law, right? 90% of everything is crud. Set all the crud apart. Look at the people who are really great critics, art critics or whatever else. They do see qualitative differences between pieces of art, right? That taco is better than that taco for these reasons. Or I am picking up X, Y, and Z. Wow, there's really great, pineapple and pork, and the acidity of the green sauce is just right? Those types of things based on a type of feeling, a type of capacity. I think that's kind of what's going on in the Humean model, right? The critic is picking up on facts. If they said that, the pork taco tasted like tofu, maybe there's a case there, but you could actually see whether there was tofu in the taco, right? So there are facts of the matter, but there is also a fair amount of feelings that take cultivation, right? But there is a lot of feeling, and I think that that's kind of the model with Hume. So with Aristotle, you have a looser type of science, a soft science, the behavioral sciences, you're looking at human nature, right? And reason is deducing and extrapolating from all of that data, try to figure out what are the ideal traits, what are the things that we need for happiness. Hume, you are kind of generalizing about humanity in a certain way, but there is no impartial point of view. And rather than extrapolating data, it's much more visceral. And I mean that in the sense of like, what do you feel in your guts? He says at one point in his philosophy, you just have to think about whether you would feel good if someone assigned that trait to you, or whether your friend or your enemy would assign that trait. So if you get assigned the trait of being deceitful, you're probably not going to feel real great about that, right? And you probably aren't going to call your friends deceitful. That's not something that most people would call their friends, or else we would really question whether they were actually friends with that person. Gut reaction, there's some sort of deep feeling. Now, naturally, right, we can develop feelings, like I said, we can develop capacities to feel and discriminate certain things, but it is that visceral, critical, maybe more artistic approach that I think Hume is trying to offer. And I'm trying to come up with a pithy saying. If this is helpful, great. If it's not, then leave this aside. But I think someone like Aristotle, whenever you're thinking about the capacities for a good life, it's thinking humanely. You have to think. Reason is really, really important. You have to be able to give an account, because part of being a social being is being able to make sense not only of your actions for yourself. I need to be able to make sense of what my life is and how I'm living it. But I also need to be able to explain myself to other people who are important to me, my community. Things have to make sense. But despite the fact that it's, cognitive, and despite the fact that it's, reason heavy, language heavy, it also has to be humane. You have to have trained your emotions. You have to train your motivations. It's not just about right action. It's about acting in the right way. Manner of execution really, really matters. Whereas I think it's the inverse for Hume, where it's feeling intelligently. Okay? The emphasis again is on sentiment or feeling. It's about trying to figure out whether you approve or disapprove of something, whether you think it's a good or a bad trait, and not think, but feel. Feel it's a good or a bad trait, whether you would love or hate that ascription to yourself. That said, The ways in which you feel need to be educated well, and you need to have familiarity with the people, with the circumstances, and all that kind of stuff. There is still a rational component there. Feelings are not just brute, they're not just dumb, they aren't unattached from reasons. Feelings are the most important. Feelings are what motivate us to do good, but they need to be educated in right ways. They can certainly be improved, and they can react rightly or wrongly to certain things, and competent or authoritative judges have more accurately discriminating feelings than just any schmo off the street, right? Okay. So now I want to go on to Jonathan Bennett's article, because I think this is one of the best articles I've ever read in philosophy. I wish I would have written it. I think the style is wonderful. I think the thesis is wonderful. But I think that it also gives rise to a really central problem for us to entertain. Okay? And the basis of this article, the setup is that we all have two faculties that lead to moral action. Okay? We have morality. He's going to call it a collection of principles. And I'm going to say it's cognitive, right? AKA it's reason. It's something that we can put into sentence form. And whenever we express those sentences can be said to be true or false. Okay? That's what I mean. This is what morality is. When I say thou shalt not murder, so you shouldn't kill innocent people, that can be either true or false. We use our reason to talk about that. It is a sort of principle. This is in contrast to sympathy, which is a fellow feeling. I feel bad whenever someone in front of me is suffering. I feel good whenever they're feeling good, right? And it's non-cognitive. Maybe it's not something where we think that truth and falsity really come into play here, right? What we need to do is just figure out whether someone actually is expressing their feelings accurately. Do you actually feel that? Well, we aren't necessarily going to dispute the feeling, all right? It's affective, I guess. It's affective. There's a feeling. Or cognitive, maybe. But, right? Morality, principles, reason, sympathy, a capacity to feel, sort of a gut emotion or a feeling. So then the central question becomes, what should we do when they conflict? Think about any number of areas in your life where they might conflict. A relationship, right? Sometimes whenever we're considering partners, there are people who are really, really good for us. They're considerate, they're intelligent, they have the same hobbies as us, you come from the same community, but you just don't feel it. Is that good enough to have a relationship with someone where you aren't feeling it, but everything else is right? I don't know. Or a job, same sort of thing. Maybe you're really in love with what you do, but it's really hard for you to get by because your salary is low and it's stressing you out and you aren't really sure whether you can hang in there. So I had friends who, for example, taught in inner city high schools, and that's kind of how they felt about their jobs. Is it good for them to have those jobs where they're so stressed that they're developing anxiety and depression and all sorts of other stuff? They're burned out. They're not getting paid much. Maybe they have to work a part-time job on top of that. So there's a lot of reasons against them doing that, but their heart is completely committed to doing that thing. So that's why I'm generalizing from just principles and fellow feeling to reason and emotion, because I think this Bennett piece is really deep. What do we do when those two faculties, right? That's what he's really, really concerned with. But rather than just make an abstract argument, he's a really excellent writer, and he finds 3 cases from history and literature that he thinks illustrate how we can answer this particular question. And he says, look, what do we do when they conflict? Well, one potential answer is they don't actually conflict, right? We arrange our psychology such that one stunts or stifles the other. You completely kill the other faculty in your psychology. And so, for example, he's going to say there's a case of someone who uses their morality to stifle their sympathy. They become so convinced of their principles that they don't even feel bad for the people that their principles might end up hurting. And he gives as an example the Calvinist Jonathan Edwards. fire and brimstone. The sinners, their nature is corrupt. They are deserving of hell. You shouldn't even feel bad about them. If they go to hell, their nature was bad, and you don't even worry about it, right? He thinks that in the theology of Jonathan Edwards, you see someone who is so convicted by their morality, so convinced of their principles, that they don't even feel bad about the suffering of other people if their principles are okay with it, right? So that's a way of getting rid of the conflict. They can't conflict if you kill one or the other side. There's a clear winner there because there's only one survivor, right? So in Jonathan Edwards, in Fire and Brimstone preaching, he thinks that the emotions are completely gone and that morality or the principles win or save the day. So these are people who say that rationality always wins and you don't have to worry about emotions. Your feelings, completely irrelevant, right? I think there's a missing case here, and I'd love to write a paper on this if I ever get enough time, because I think that alternatively, there is potentially someone who might say the same thing. Sympathy wins out so much that you don't even worry about principles or rationality or whatever else. I think that this would be like a really radical version of sentimentalism, a really brute version of maybe Hume, as we've been talking about. But I think there's probably other options in the history of philosophy that I don't necessarily want to say because I don't know that I want to peg anyone with this particular view. But I think that would also be another thing. How do you solve the conflict? Well, you get rid of the conflict by killing one side or the other, right? So he shows us how that works in the example of Jonathan Edwards. What's the other case? Well, one side wins. Both sides still exist, but one side always wins. So what's one example? He says, morality revising sympathy. So this is a case of someone who they understand their principles. They don't let their sympathy die out. They still feel sympathy, right? So if their morality is causing them to cause suffering in other people, they still feel that in a really deep way, but they are okay with it ultimately. And he gives the example of Heinrich Himmler, who's one of the top Nazi officials in World War II Germany, and he became convinced that, the extermination of the Jewish people was necessary. And Bennett draws on his diaries and biographies to show that he had basically nervous tics, anxiety, indigestive problems, because he felt the suffering of the people that he was basically condemning. But he so believed in his principles that he allowed his sympathies to be ignored. Okay? He allowed his sympathies to be ignored. And that is what he thinks happens in the case of Heinrich Himmler. All right? Side note, there's been a really disturbing rise of anti-Semitism in America, and I don't really know what to make of it. It's affecting a lot of my friends. Do some soul searching. If you ever start to listen to beliefs or subscribe to beliefs, and at the top is just like Jewish people running things, because if you run into stuff like that, chances are you're anti-Semitic. Or you're getting very close to organizations that are anti-Semitic, and you are playing or towing a very dangerous line, right? But the reason why I bring that up is like conspiracy theories. So, for example, if you go really deep into something like the flat Earth theories and why people would have this conspiracy to make people think that the Earth is round, right? A lot of those get very anti-Semitic very quickly because it's Jewish people at the top in those. I don't know that that's a really fantastic example of morality revising sympathy, but this is a really great example of how ideas can be used to stunt the feelings of your sympathy, right? So maybe we're getting into the Jonathan Edwards territory where sympathy is just like completely irrelevant. But the example here is a tough one. It's a really tough one. And I think that he intentionally chose this, because if there's one camp that most philosophers fall into, it's probably this one. It's probably into the camp that says that morality or rationality, big surprise, these nerdy egghead philosophers that are really good at thinking and writing, they tell you that thinking and language and rationality are things that always should be trusted, even over emotions, right? He's saying, be careful, because there are a great many zealots and a great many people who used their morality and went against their feeling bad to do really monstrous. So that's one. And the hero of the essay is someone who allows their sympathy to revise their morality, and he talks about Huck Finn. So in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck Finn is helping Jim. So Huck Finn ran away. Huck Finn runs into Jim, a slave, who's also running away to sort of get his family. And they're helping each other out. They sort of become friends. And they're floating up the Mississippi River to get Jim his freedom. And from the shore, someone calls them. And Huck knows that he's in deep, deep trouble if he gets caught with a runaway slave. Because back then it was someone's property. You were, committing a conspiracy. You were going against an entire side in the Civil War, right? It was a bad thing to do according to morality. Morality being principles, right? Principles, okay? And Bennett also calls this bad morality. So what do we do with moralities that we don't agree with the principles? But I've broadened it because I think the lessons apply much better whenever you broaden it. So Huck Finn is being called to from the shore. He knows that he's doing something wrong according to the principles that exist at that time, right? And he thinks about turning Jim in. But he vouches for Jim, okay? And he decides to help Jim keep escaping. And the deciding factor is he says, you know what? Jim is my friend, okay? And I feel good about him. He's helped me out. He's going to get his family. And he allows his emotions to revise his morality or his principle. He allows his emotions, his fellow feeling, to revise his reason or his principle. And obviously, this is something that Bennett agrees with. And again, I think that it makes sense to deliver this to philosophers and to a lot of people because philosophers tend to be really concept heavy. They tend to be really cognitive. To sort of espouse the emotions is also to go against a lot of philosophers. We'll get to Peter Singer. Peter Singer is going to say emotions are basically irrelevant, right? So we'll see some of this later on in the class. So what's the conclusion of all of this? Well, the conclusion is all of your faculties need to be working well in order to revise your moral practices, okay? Sympathy makes us human, so we cannot give that up. We can't give up reason. Most people are going to say, right? So that's not really a consideration for Bennett. But he's going to say we can't give up sympathy either. If we want to be human, we need to feel bad whenever people are suffering in front of us. We need to feel good whenever people are enjoying things that humans do, right? That's really, really important. And how are we ever going to stand a chance at revising bad morality, bad institutions, if we don't have functioning? So he has a type of psychological holism here, meaning that all of the things have to be working well in order for everything to be working well. Your sympathies aren't working, your moral practices and faculties are not going to be as good off. And same thing with reason, right? Despite that, he's going to say that, look, all principles must be revisable. Get to that. But the second part is really important. We must strongly assent to our principles, but also be humble. So part of you knowing what you believe and committing to a particular belief system means that you strongly hold those convictions. You assent those ideas. You think they're right. Okay? If you are a fan of something, it doesn't make sense to say that you're not a fan of it, at least in a sincere way. And or for example, you might really be a huge fan of a particular movie. And sure, there might be flaws here and there, but overall, you really, really love that thing. Or I think a relationship or a friendship is kind of like that. If you are actually friends with someone, you love that person basically in their entirety. Are there things that they might be able to improve on, right? Yes. Are there aspects of their lives where their journey isn't quite finished? Or as Judge Judy puts, where they aren't quite fully cooked yet? Yeah, probably, right? But part of being a friend is loving that person. Part of you being a moral human being is holding principles and holding them sincerely. Okay? That's really important. But we also need to be humble and realize that certain things that we think, certain ways that we live, they might be able to be better. Now, naturally, if you thought that they could be better, you would probably be trying to improve them, right? The dissonance is really uncomfortable. You can live with it, right? But for the most part, if you actually thought that there was a better way out there, you probably are trying to work to actively move toward that, right? So he's saying, generally, we approve of the way that we're living our lives, but we need to be humble and realize that things could be better, and we need to be open to sympathy, giving us clues about things that we should care about, or maybe even new data, giving us, things that we should consider. And the last point here is that we need strong reasons to go against human suffering. So the Himmler example is really, really tough because he's doing something that good writers do, and he's making you see that someone who is potentially evil, you want to use that term, which if it applies to anyone, it definitely applies to Himmler. Seeing that they're actually very human and that maybe we could probably be like them, right? There's a moral complexity. People aren't all good. They aren't all bad. Himmler ignored his sympathies to, orchestrate the killing of 6 million Jewish people, 10 million people overall, right? People who were queer of various types, people who had various disabilities, all those types of things, people from different ethnicities, as the Romani. He ignored his sympathies. He felt bad about it, but he was convinced he was doing the right thing. He says very quickly that it's not always the case that we should always listen to sympathy. There are some times that reason should win. What's an example of that? Well, he thought that going into World War II was exactly the right example of ignoring your sympathies in order to do something that's right. There were a great many pacifists that said that the Americans or the British people, for example, shouldn't get involved in World War II. Why? Because as soon as people get involved, more soldiers are going to die. Innocent families are going to lose their children and their fathers and their parents, all sorts of things. If there's bombings of cities, innocent people are going to die in those. All of the atrocities of war, and there are many, many more that I could list, are going to be affected on way more people if we get involved. That's what the pacifists basically were trying to say, and they said that we should not intervene, right? Because they saw the suffering that intervening would lead to. Bennett, however, says it's good for us to stifle our sympathy in that case because of humanitarian reasons, because of whatever reasons. So that there are cases where reason can override your sympathies, but they need to be strong. They need to be strong. Genocide is not a strong reason. Anti-Semitism is not a good reason. Xenophobia, trying to say that the foreigners are taking your jobs. That's not a good reason. There are lots of really bad reasons out there. But occasionally, and again, this is consistent with the virtue ethicists or the people who see the world as very complex, occasionally you have to do bad things because the situation is really bad. Okay? And that's what he's trying to say. So the conclusion of the article, I think, is dead on. Try to develop all of your faculties, your reason and your motion, because the better everything is working, the better you're going to be able to be. And the more data, the more that you understand, the more complexities you understand in life, the more points of views you understand, the higher a chance there is that you're going to be able to uncover your own biases and try to improve the things that can actually be improved in your life. Right? That's really, really important. Everything should be revisable, despite the fact that if you're actually living intently and sincerely, you shouldn't doubt anything about how you're living in the living, right? So if you ever want to be a great musician or a great romantic partner or something like that, you don't doubt it in the middle of the kiss. It's going to feel insincere and not good, right? But you should always be open to the fact that maybe that person isn't the right person for you. Again, if we're talking about morality, I don't think that relationships necessarily work that way, but I'm trying to draw a contrast between we live sincerely, we get life done in the living, in the acting, and being caught up in things and having relationships, but we should also have humility that the things we have the deepest convictions about, more principles supported, or our emotions deeply feel in that way. We should have enough humility to consider that we should revise those practices, right? That's kind of the takeaway lesson from Bennett. So what are we doing here, right? What are we doing here? Virtue ethics, as opposed to the next two theories that we're going to talk about, which are act-based theories, the focus is on how we should be. What kind of people should we be? In the case of Aristotle, what situations am I facing and what kind of disposition develop in relation to facing fear, to develop courage, and avoid cowardice and rashness, right? But in the case of Hume, I have lots of complex interactions in life and events and facts and that kind of stuff. How should I feel toward these? How should I cultivate my capacities for my moral sense or my feeling? And they also focus on life's goals, right? So the shape and the feel of life, how we balance out all of those competing goods. What do we do with respect to that? And any recommendation for action only makes sense in context. Okay? Particularism is really important here. You cannot make judgments without reference to the empirical details on the ground of who the person is, what the action is, how stuff is going, right? What that person's life goals are, how they should execute that particular action. Action only makes sense in relation to the context of people and their particular socio-historical circumstance, where they are, what community they're in, what historical period they're in, etc., right? You have to contextualize things because universal stuff is not all that useful. You always have to figure out how to apply it anyway. And then the last thing is that basically what we've done, especially in the virtue ethics literature, is show you moral psychology. So how should you develop your thoughts and your emotion and your motivational faculty and your dispositions to develop habits in certain ways, right? How do we think about that? We can't just ignore that. We can't just use formula. And the moral psychology, if we neglect it, if we neglect how people actually are or the ways that we should be, then we're missing something very, very important in terms of morality. Okay, so I think that that's the core component. That's the core component of the last two. So as opposed to the act-based theories, which are going to focus on should I do this action, yes or no, you can kind of do that in virtue ethics, but you can't do it without asking larger scale questions about the shape of life or the kind of person we should be. And you can't do it without contextualizing that action or that person. There is nothing in the abstract. With Aristotle, again, we have this rational sort of reason first approach where you understand what a human is as a human. That's what makes your theory of flourishing. And then your virtues are decided on what things humans universally face that influence their happiness and how you should be. And we have the Humean version where it's sentiment based. You need lots of background information. You need a moral education and stuff like that to make sure that your sentiments are functioning correctly. But you still are also wondering, should I be feeling good or bad toward that thing? Is my moral sense telling me something about the facts of the matter out there in the world? So that's a lot. That's a lot. And these thinkers are complex, but I hope that they're starting to make sense now that we're contrasting them. So as we go forward in the course, obviously we're going to get more and more theories, but hopefully this comparison kind of shows some of the important things that we've talked about. Thank you so much for your attention. I will see you next time.